Hey guys, just finished another audiobook today, which has sparked a discussion topic that I think is, again, important, and we have a lot of these conversations, but it's around the topic of ego. And in kind of researching, ego is a relatively newer topic, but has always been with us as humans, and our ego has always sort of been our crutch or a crippling trait that we've experienced, right? And so I want to talk today about the role that our egos play in our lives and really look at, I initially had 5, but I came up with 6 different ways that our egos get in the way of us leading a fulfilling and happy lifestyle and also really reaching our full potential. So we're going to dive into that. I've been reading several books. So I just finished today Ego is the Enemy by Ryan Holiday. It's the second Holiday book that I finished blasting through these audiobooks. And the first one was called The Obstacle is the Way, talking about how adversity is opportunity and we need to look to adversity as a chance to grow. And that is actually, we want to look to that positively, whereas ego stands in our way. So ego is the enemy. And this concept is all kind of part of the whole Stoicism, which is really being able to look at adverse situations in life without complaint and, like I said, seeing them in a positive light. There's also another book that I'm working through now, which is called Alter Ego, and it's actually portraying ego in a positive way. So actually discussing how we can create this alter ego for ourselves that is sort of that version of us that takes us to the next level in performance. So for instance, like Kobe Bryant, his alter ego would be the Black Mamba, right? So he's not always going to be the Black Mamba. There's times he's going to be Kobe Bryant when he's wanting to relax or be with his family and have his personal life. But when he steps onto the court or when he's doing his workouts or anything that's related to his career performance, then he becomes the Black Mamba. And I think a lot of people have an alter ego. We don't always necessarily recognize that. And that book is interesting in that it's shining a positive light on ego, which I think is possible, right? But we have to be aware of the role that our ego is playing in our lives. So creating an alter ego, and I talked to my clients about this, that version of yourself that is will snap out and want to play video games or snap out and want to watch Netflix. That alter ego is that version of you who is sort of like super heroic and always wants to do the workout and like give it 100% or make the right decisions. And so that is your sort of superhero version of you. Most of the time, though, ego can be very damaging, and that's kind of what we're going to look at tonight, right? So there's that book, The Alter Ego, Alter, and then another book that I have not yet read, but I'm sort of now determining I need to do this study about ego overall because I've had recurring themes of ego come up. So there's this book called Alter Ego, yes, again, like altar, but as in church altar, Altar, by Craig Rochelle. And so that is saying essentially divorcing ourselves from our fleshly ego and accepting the role of who God says we are and who God appoints us to be, right? So another book, though, about ego, interesting there. And then, the first literature that I really started reading about ego was from Eckhart Tolle, who I've talked about before on here, and he's got a couple of great books. And so one of those that he talks a lot about the ego in is A New Earth, Awakening Your Life's Purpose, but also even in the power of now. So Eckhart, he kind of centers his life's work around being in the present moment and also self-acceptance and in freeing ourselves from the ego, because the ego has trouble with just being present and just being still because it is afraid that it's going to receive judgment for that. And the ego always wants to be trying to gain attention and to make itself look good, right? That version of us is always seeking to appeal to other people. So we're going to go through and look at some ways that the ego can be detrimental. By the way, I just looked because I wanted to reference the Bible regarding ego. And from my understanding, what I got, the word ego is not even mentioned, not once even in the Bible. That's why I say I think it's more of a modern term. However, pride and ego sort of go hand in hand, and they have a relevance because the ego is essentially that pride that we have about ourselves, and that whole idea that we want to build ourselves up. And pride can also be very damaging. But here we're not. So pride is more that act or that verb, whereas the ego is more that personification or that noun that we encompass, right? So I'm going to give you some more feedback after as well. But here's also, and you know what? The message always sort of comes together when I don't plan it. But in my reading this morning from Coach John Wooden, he mentions in here as part of his pyramid of success, and these foundations or the parts of the pyramid, and it was talking about cooperation, which is one of the steps on his pyramid of success. He says that cooperation is present within a team when a leader is more concerned with what's right than who is right. And, and looking at that, that's a statement about ego, right? It's saying that in order to be an effective leader and to separate yourself from ego, you have to be able to allow others sometimes to be right and not always feel like we have to be the one to get the last word or we always have to be right. We're more concerned about with what is right than who is right, and us owning that and always being and feeling in control. So let's look at these whole concepts of the ways that ego can be detrimental, right? So number one, I feel like is that ego forces us into materialism. So ego is that whole concept we're always trying to keep up with the Joneses, because our ego, it wants us to feel and look good and have this image that we have to keep up. And so materialism allows that because it's this whole concept of how success is perceived through financial gain or different material ownership. So the number two way that ego can really compromise our lives is it prevents us from feeling adequate. Okay, so the ego is constantly seeking more, and really, as long as the ego is in charge, we can never truly feel fulfilled because the ego always wants more. It's so demanding, right? And it constantly craves. And so the ego really forces us into being people pleasers and always trying to seek the attention or the approval of other people. And sometimes that even means being like deceitful, but whatever we can, it's not really about making other people like us. We don't really care about them liking, but we want the whole idea of we want to feel good about ourselves because we want the approval. And sometimes we can care less what they actually think as long as they approve of us or we've sort of created a facade that has convinced them. So it can be very damaging, the fact that, we feel inadequate. The ego constantly feels inadequate, and we can't just be and accept who we are in the moment if the ego is at work, right? So we've got, again, that's the reason we have to be able to step away from the ego. All right. And then ego prevents us from being our authentic selves. And I think that's really important there, is that the ego fears vulnerability, and we don't want to be transparent because, and I think that gets tricky with social media because we only want to put up our best, right? We want to show I'm living my best life now, and I don't want you to see anything else behind the scenes, because that would compromise our ego's desire to make it appear as if everything is grand, right? So the ego sort of causes us to lock away some of our deepest, darkest secrets that probably need to be discussed, but we don't want the world, the ego doesn't want the world to witness those things because that would be damaging to our image, and the ego hates that, okay? The fourth way that the ego impacts us is that it prevents us from learning more, okay? So this is the whole concept of pride. So I think of mentoring young student athletes, and one of the biggest challenges there is that they have this whole attitude of that they know it all, right? And that's a lot of teenagers when we're young, like we have this whole concept of like, we know everything, we don't want any guidance or feedback, we've got it under control, and we sort of put up this whole like wall, because if we were to have humility and say, no, actually, I don't know it all, I want to learn more, then we appear vulnerable because there's a crack in the armor. And especially a teenage ego, does not like that, right? Because as teenagers, we want to appear invincible. So what happens there is that whole idea of pride gets in the way, because we want to say, well, I already know everything. There's nothing new to learn. So pride prevents us from growing because it convinces us that we've already got everything we need, right? Essentially saying that if you were to confess that I have room to grow, then you don't have it all together. And which is not the case, but that's what the ego leads you to believe, right? So the ego can prevent us from growing and learning, being open to new ideas, right? And then a fifth way here that the ego is damaging is it prevents us from taking risk. Okay, so I think the last one here that prevents us from learning more is that pride concept, because that's saying, I've already got everything figured out. I don't need your help, right? So that's pride. So fear is the other aspect of the ego that comes into play, and that's what prevents us from taking risk in life and holds so many people back from actually advancing and getting to a point where they reach their full potential. Especially I think about in careers or travel or different things like thrill seeking, is that people have so what happens is we have a fear of failure. So the idea is that, well, if I take a risk, then I potentially fail. And what happens then is then my image is compromised. Like there's a chance that my ego will suffer because if I am not successful in my endeavor, people will judge me for that. So it's safer to not take the risk and stay back here where I know I can be successful and guarded, and I can put up this whole idea that life is grand, even if inside I desire more. But seeking more might mean taking a risk, appearing vulnerable, potentially failing, and then the ego sees that as like the end all, right? Like that would be a disaster for the ego. Better for the ego to protect itself, hang back, play it safe, than to advance, risking failure, because then your image would be damaged. And so the ego hates that. And unfortunately, that's why so many people don't ever reach that next rung on the ladder or reach their full potential, because the ego strickens them with the fear to advance and take the risk necessary, right? So two things there. Pride keeps us from learning more, and fear keeps us from taking risk to advance. And then the final way that ego can be damaging to us is that it prevents us from being fully present. And that's why I mentioned, like with Eckhart Tolle in The Power of Now or A New Earth, is that the fact that the ego, it really struggles to rest. And the ego always wants more and more and more, wants to be in action, and has to appear busy. There's this whole concept of if I'm busy, that I'm productive. And this whole idea of if we mistake movement for productivity, right? But to the ego, as long as I can convince the public around me that I am busy, then I will appear important, because a busy, full schedule and lots of involvement in things demonstrates this whole idea of importance to society, regardless of how productive you are, right? And so, but the ego doesn't care about that. The ego's not concerned about like internally what we're experiencing. The ego is more concerned about what the outside world thinks, and then feeling like we've got everyone fooled. And so that's another reason. So we can't really be present in the moment if the ego is always at unrest, needing to get that next accomplishment or that next material item, or make sure it's keeping up with the Joneses. You can't just be present, accept where you're at in life, and take a moment to breathe. So those are 6 ways that the ego can be really damaging and prevent us from living a fulfilled and happy life that allows us to reach our full potential and really maximize what we can learn and our wisdom, as well as be willing to take the risk necessary to achieve at a maximum level, right? And to do it because we desire to do it, not because the ego desires it for the sake of protecting or building up our own image. And so I mentioned that wooden quote. There's another quote here that I documented from Epictetus, one of the great philosophers, who says, if you want to improve, you must be content to be thought of as foolish and stupid. So it might sound a little funny, but if you really think about it, what we're saying is that if you really want to open yourself up and say, you know what, I still have so much yet to learn and so much room to grow, you're displeasing the ego, but you're really opening the door for yourself to advance. And that's an act of humility, right? So ultimate humility is being able to say, I'm not at my best right now, and I have room for growth. But that's what we always want to be, because we can never learn and achieve everything, even in the longest possible lifetime. So we want to be careful that we're not constantly prisoner to our egos, because the ego can really hold us back and be damaging. And we'll continue to talk about this topic. It's a very fascinating discussion, as well as I work through these two books, Alter Ego, Alter, and Altar, one that's more biblically based, and the other one, which I really like the fact that shines a positive light on ego and shows how we can use that alter ego to, really snap into that performance mode to take us to the next level. So we'll continue to talk about this. I'll do some writing about it. I'm going to share the link to these books on my Forsythe Wellness Facebook page. So if you're not following along on there on Facebook, at Forsythe Wellness, also on Instagram at Derek Forsythe, and then throw this video up on YouTube. We'll get some more content as well. I want to remind you guys as well, hey, if you guys are struggling at all with mental health issues, please do not ignore your mental health. Please reach out to myself or another trusted mental health professional, and we can get you connected right now to telehealth or an in-person session. We're going to be back in the clinic soon. I'm hopeful about that, and we're kind of really advancing and expanding the way that we provide services to offer more options to people, and that is really exciting. But number one is, don't ignore your mental health. Let's really take care of things and make sure you're optimizing your emotional, mental well-being, as well as all those other factors. But I know people are in the gym. We always think about our physique and our physical well-being. We also want to give attention to our mental health. And like I said, I was checking YouTube for more content. One other thing I'm thinking of right now is I'm working on pulling together old content I'm going to archive on my website, and I'll give you guys information about that as it kind of progresses, because it is going to be a longer process. So the Sunday night messages that I used to write, a lot of you might be familiar with that. Beginning in 2012 or 13, when I was doing the Sunday night inspirational messages, that was long before I had any intent of being in the health and wellness field. I was just trying to do that to encourage people. So what I'm doing now is I'm going back and pulling all of that old content that I wrote that was related to health and motivation and wellness, or anything that was inspirational. And we're going to archive that on my website. So those of you who really derived a lot of value, because I know at a certain point we had a lot of people following that, and that was really meaningful. And we want to be able to pull that all into one place. So we'll get that up there soon. I'm going to keep working on just pulling all that in and loading it on forsythewellness.org. But I'll keep you guys posted as we move along with that. I'm just trying to provide as many resources as possible for you, share links to podcasts, books, anything that's important. We're going to have these conversations as I'm fascinated, or as I have a conversation topic that weighs on my heart and I believe needs to be shared. I'm going to bring it here to you guys. All right. So I appreciate you guys joining, and have a good rest of your night. Thanks a lot.